My father is suffering from severe late-stage dementia, Your Honor. He doesn't know where he is, he can't manage his basic needs, and he certainly isn't capable of making financial decisions. My 36-year-old daughter, Chloe, spoke those words with a voice full of fake sorrow, standing at the lectern of a dimly lit probate courtroom. She wore a modest black dress, her hair pulled back neatly, dabbing at a tearless eye with a pale blue handkerchief. Beside her sat her husband, Mark, who nodded in solemn agreement, holding a thick folder of forged medical affidavits. Sitting across from them at the respondents' table, I stayed completely still. At 66 years old, wearing my best charcoal suit, I kept my hands folded neatly over a simple leather notebook. I didn't yell, I didn't interrupt, I just looked at my daughter, the girl I had carried on my shoulders through the apple orchards I had spent 40 years building from bare dirt into a multi-million-dollar commercial harvest enterprise. "Mr. Vance," Judge Harrison said, looking over his half-moon spectacles at me with genuine concern, "your daughter has filed an emergency petition for full conservatorship over your estate, your bank accounts, and the total operational control of Vance Orchards. She claims you have lost touch with reality." "I am aware of what she claims, Your Honor," I replied, my voice steady, low, and quiet. "He's confusing today with 20 years ago," Chloe cried out, her voice cracking in a masterclass of staged heartbreak. "He wanders around the property at night, talking to people who aren't there. We are doing this to protect him from himself before he ruins everything." The judge sighed, flipping through the stack of papers Chloe's high-priced attorney had submitted. "The court has a temporary psychiatric evaluation here signed by Dr. Kenneth Reed, stating you are nonverbal and severely cognitive impaired. Mr. Vance, do you have medical testimony to present?" I looked toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor, my doctor is on his way." Chloe turned toward me, a tiny, triumphant smirk flashing across her face for half a second, hidden from the judge, but meant entirely to me. She thought she had timed everything perfectly. She thought the doctor she had paid off would be the only medical authority the court would hear. She had no idea that the real doctor was about to walk through those doors, holding the one piece of evidence that would blow her entire life wide open. To understand how a father ends up sitting in a cold courtroom watching his only child try to declare him legally brain dead, you have to go back 6 months. I am a simple man. I lost my wife Sarah 8 years ago to a sudden aneurysm. After she passed, the 400 acres of high-yield apple orchards in eastern Washington became my absolute world. I woke up at 5 every morning, checking irrigation lines, managing 40 seasonal workers, and maintaining the packing facilities I had built with my own hands. I wasn't rich in terms of flying private jets, but the land was fully paid for, and the operational reserve fund held just over $2 million. Chloe was my pride and joy. When she married Mark, a smooth-talking commercial real estate broker, I gave them a 3-bedroom home on the edge of the property, rent-free. I paid for her college, her wedding, and every business venture Mark attempted that quietly collapsed within 6 months. I loved her unconditionally. The trouble started in November, right after the autumn harvest. I was sitting in my office in the main barn when Chloe walked in carrying a mug of hot cider. She set it on my desk, sat across from me, and leaned in with a look of deep concern. "Dad," she said softly, touching my hand, "Mark and I noticed you left the tractors out in the rain yesterday, and last week you asked me the same question 3 times in one afternoon." I paused, looking at her. "The tractors were left out because the transport mechanics were delayed, Chloe, and I asked about your mortgage because the bank called my home phone by mistake." "See," said Chloe, her eyes wide with worry, completely ignoring my explanation, "you're getting defensive. That's a classic early sign. We just want you to rest, Dad. You've worked so hard." I brushed it off as overprotective love.
What father wouldn't want to believe his daughter was just caring for him? But 3 days later, the first subtle red flag appeared. I went to our local credit union to sign the quarterly payroll checks for my orchard staff. Old Hank, the branch manager who had known me for 30 years, looked down at his screen with an uneasy frown. "Thomas," Hank murmured, leaning over the counter, "your account has a temporary administrative flag on it." "A flag?" I asked. "For what?" "Chloe came in yesterday with a notarized durable power of attorney paperwork," Hank said, his voice dropping. "She said you were having memory lapses and requested that all checks over $10,000 require her dual authorization."
My heart did a strange, painful flutter. "Did she show you a medical document?" Hank replied, looking at me with genuine sympathy. "Thomas, is everything okay at home?" I told Hank it was just a misunderstanding, signed the payroll manually, and drove straight back to the orchard. My mind was racing. Why would Chloe go to the bank behind my back? When I pulled up to the house, Mark was standing in my driveway talking to a man in a tailored gray suit holding a clipboard. They were walking around the packing facility, taking photos of the perimeter and pointing at the land boundaries. "Mark," I called out, stepping out of my truck, "who's your friend?" Mark jumped slightly, his face flushing before he recovered his smooth demeanor. "Oh, Thomas, this is Julian from West Coast Realty Group. Just getting a casual appraisal of the acreage, for insurance update purposes." "I update our insurance every March with State Farm," I said, looking Julian straight in the eye. "We don't use commercial real estate appraisers." "Just forward planning, Thomas," said Mark, with a forced laugh, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "If you ever decide to step back and enjoy retirement, it's good to know what the land is worth on the commercial market." "The land is not for sale," I said firmly. "It will never be for sale. It goes into a family land trust for Chloe and her children." That evening, dinner at the main house was suffocatingly quiet. Chloe served roast chicken, but every time I spoke, she and Mark exchanged quiet, meaningful glances, nodding to each other as if my words were the rambling nonsense of a broken man. "Dad," said Chloe gently, handing me a small paper cup with 2 blue pills, "the doctor said these will help with your evening confusion and anxiety." I looked at the pills. "What doctor, Chloe? I haven't seen Dr. Evans in 6 months." "I spoke with a specialist downtown," she said smoothly, smiling with absolute warmth. "Dr. Reed. He reviewed your charts and prescribed these to keep your mind calm. Drink your water, Dad." I didn't take the pills. When Chloe turned to clear the table, I slid them into my pocket. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the big house felt heavy, almost hostile. I got out of bed, walked down to the kitchen, and sat at the table in the dark, staring at the blue pills lying in the palm of my hand. My mind kept retracing every conversation, every look, every small change over the last month. Was I actually losing my memory? Was I forgetting things without realizing it? The fear of losing one's own mind is the most terrifying psychological weapon anyone can use against you. For a few hours, I actually doubted myself. I wondered if my daughter was right, if age had finally caught up to me, and if I was just too stubborn to see it. At 2 a.m., I heard soft footsteps on the porch outside. I looked through the window blinds. Mark was standing near the edge of the yard, talking on his cell phone in a low, intense voice. I slipped out the back door, staying in the shadow of the tall oak trees near the driveway. "I don't care about the environmental inspection," Mark was saying into the phone, his voice sharp with greed. "The buyer offered $9 million for the 400 acres. If we convert the orchard into a residential housing development, our commission alone is $700,000. The old man is blocking the sale. We're finalizing the paperwork this month. Just get the developers ready." I stood frozen in the cold night air, the dark soil beneath my boots feeling like it was dissolving.
$9 million. Residential housing. It wasn't about my health. It was never about my health. They didn't want to care for an aging father. They wanted to erase him so they could sell 40 years of my sweat and blood to a suburban housing developer. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I sat down on a wooden crate in the dark barn, my hands shaking uncontrollably. My wife and I had planted those trees when we didn't have $50 to our name. Every root in that dirt was tied to a memory of Sarah, of Chloe's childhood, of a lifetime of honest labor. And my own daughter was preparing to pave it over for a commission check. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. I knew that if I confronted them directly, without proof, they would simply accelerate their plan, use my anger as proof of dementia-induced aggression, and have me institutionalized immediately. I had to be patient. I had to play the confused, gentle old man while I figured out how deep this poison ran. 2 days later, I drove downtown under the pretense of buying tractor parts. Instead, I went straight to the private practice office of Dr. Kenneth Reed, the doctor whose name was on the pill bottle. The office was located in a sleek, modern medical building. I walked up to the receptionist. "I'd like to see Dr. Reed. I'm Thomas Vance."
The receptionist looked at her screen, then looked up at me with a strange, guarded expression. "Mr. Vance, your daughter, Chloe, requested that all communications regarding your care go through her directly." "I am the patient," I said calmly, "and I am paying the bills." A few minutes later, Dr. Reed came out. He was a man in his late 90s, thin-haired, wearing an expensive watch with a cold, transactional demeanor. He led me into his private office and sat behind a large mahogany desk. "Thomas," Dr. Reed said, opening a file, "your daughter has expressed deep concern regarding your cognitive decline. The prescriptions I issued are standard mood stabilizers to ease the transition into full-time care." "Dr. Reed," I said, leaning forward, keeping my voice utterly placid, "you have never examined me. You have never run a single cognitive test on me. How can you prescribe medication and write letters to my bank claiming I have late-stage dementia?" Dr. Reed smiled thinly, adjusting his pen. "In modern geriatric medicine, family reporting carries immense weight. Chloe provided detailed logs of your disorientation, night wandering, and inability to handle financial records. Given your age, early-onset vascular dementia is the most logical diagnosis." "And did Chloe mention that she stands to gain millions if I am declared unfit?" I asked quietly. Dr. Reed's smile faded. His posture stiffened. "Mr. Vance, I am a certified medical professional. My medical opinions are based on clinical observation." "Which you conducted without ever speaking to me," I countered. "If you feel uncomfortable with my care, you are free to seek a second opinion," Dr. Reed said coldly, shutting the folder. "But as it stands, my professional evaluation remains on your record. Good day." I walked out of that medical building realizing the terrifying reality of my situation. Chloe hadn't just made a mistake, she had systematically constructed a legal and medical paper trail designed to trap me. In the eyes of the law, a signed letter from a licensed doctor carries more weight than the word of an old farmer insisting he is sane. I needed help, but I couldn't go to local lawyers or local friends. Chloe and Mark were watching my every move. Every time I left the house, Mark would check my truck's mileage. Every phone call I made on the landline was monitored.
I felt like a prisoner in my own home. One afternoon, while Chloe was out in town, I went into the small guest house where Chloe and Mark lived. I knew it was risky, but I needed to know how far along their timeline was. I used my master key, stepped into Mark's home office, and began searching his desk.
Underneath a stack of real estate magazines, I found a clear plastic binder labeled Vance Estate Development. I opened it. Inside were detailed blueprints for a 120-unit luxury housing subdivision named The Orchards at Willow Creek. But what made my blood run cold was the document attached to the back page. It was an emergency application for court-ordered involuntary psychiatric commitment scheduled to be filed in county probate court in 6 weeks. Attached to it was a forged prescription log showing I had been taking heavy antipsychotic medication, along with a statement signed by Chloe claiming I had threatened her physically in the kitchen. They weren't just going to take my land, they were going to put me in a locked memory care facility for the rest of my life so I could never contest the sale. As I stood there reading the terrible words, I heard a car door slam outside. Chloe and Mark were back. My heart pounded against my ribs like a trapped bird. I quickly shut the binder, placed it exactly where I had found it, and slipped out through the side laundry door just as Chloe stepped onto the front porch. I crouched behind the hedge, holding my breath, waiting until they walked inside, before quietly walking back to my house. That night, I sat in my dark living room, staring at a framed photograph of my late wife Sarah holding Chloe as a baby in the middle of our first apple harvest. Sarah had worked until her hands were raw, saving every penny so Chloe could have a life of comfort and grace. "What did we do wrong, Sarah?" I whispered to the empty room, tears finally stinging my eyes. "How did our little girl turn into this?" I realized then that grief and heartbreak could either destroy me or give me ultimate clarity. I couldn't save my relationship with Chloe. She had already destroyed it. But I could protect the legacy Sarah and I had built, and I could stop my daughter from committing a terrible crime that would ruin her soul forever. I needed a plan, a quiet, disciplined, undeniable plan.
The next morning, I made my first move. I didn't call the lawyer in town. Instead, I drove 30 miles to the neighboring county and visited a retired Superior Court judge named Arthur Vance, my older brother, whom I hadn't spoken to in 3 years because of an old family dispute. Arthur sat in his study, listening in complete silence as I laid out the medical letters, the blueprints, the bank flags, and the stolen medication logs. When I finished, Arthur leaned back, his aged face pale with fury. "She's trying to declare you legally dead while you're still breathing, Thomas." "I don't want revenge, Arthur," I said quietly. "I just want the truth to be undeniable. If I just hire a lawyer and fight her in court, it will turn into a long, ugly battle of he said, she said. She'll claim I'm acting out because of my illness. I need absolute proof of my sanity, and I need to catch her in the exact moment she tries to strike." Arthur looked at me, a sharp glint returning to his eyes. "Then we don't block her court filing. We let her file it." "Let her file it?" I asked. "Yes," Arthur said, leaning over his desk. "If you try to stop her now, she'll just change tactics. Let her build her complete lie. Let her bring her fraudulent medical documents into court under oath. But before that court date happens, you are going to undergo a complete, rigorous, independent neurological and psychiatric evaluation at the University Medical Center in Seattle." For the next month, I lived a double life. By day, I played the quiet, declining old father at the orchard. I pretended not to notice when Mark started bringing prospective developers onto the property. I let Chloe guide me by the arm when we walked down the driveway, pretending to stumble occasionally, letting her believe her plan was working flawlessly. By night, I drove secretly to Seattle. Over 3 full weeks, I underwent comprehensive brain imaging, cognitive tests, memory assessments, and psychiatric evaluations conducted by Dr. Elizabeth Mercer, the head of neurology at Washington University, one of the foremost experts on geriatric cognitive health in the country.
Dr. Mercer spent hours testing my processing speed, spatial awareness, long-term memory, and emotional stability. At the end of the 3 weeks, Dr. Mercer sat me down in her office, holding a 60-page sealed diagnostic dossier. "Mr. Vance," she said, looking at me with admiration, "your cognitive function is in the top 5% for men of your age. You have 0 signs of dementia, vascular decay, or neurological decline. You are as sharp as a man 30 years younger." "Will you testify to this in court, doctor?" I asked. "Not only will I testify," Dr. Mercer said firmly, "I will bring the full brain scans, the blood panel analysis, and the recorded video assessments. What this Dr. Reed did without examining you is not just medical malpractice, it is criminal fraud." I held that sealed dossier in my hands as I drove back to the orchard. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for my daughter to spring it. 2 weeks later, the notice arrived. Chloe had filed her emergency petition for full conservatorship and immediate involuntary commitment. She had scheduled the hearing for a Tuesday morning, choosing a probate judge who was known for expediting family conservatorship requests to prevent elderly self-harm. She didn't even tell me about the court date. She intended to have the sheriff serve the commitment order at my home after the judge signed it in my absence. She had no idea that Arthur had monitored the court docket every single day and secured a legal notice of appearance on my behalf just 24 hours before the hearing. Which brings us back to that quiet, tense courtroom on that brisk Tuesday morning. Chloe stood at the lectern, dabbing at her dry eyes, finishing her tragic speech to Judge Harrison. "We just want to get him the help he needs, Your Honor," Chloe sobbed gently. "He is confused, aggressive, and unable to manage his life. Please, sign the conservatorship order today before he hurts himself or loses the family land." Judge Harrison looked down at the documents Chloe had submitted. "And you have provided a signed declaration from Dr. Kenneth Reed certifying Mr. Vance's late-stage dementia?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mark spoke up from the table, holding his chin high. "Dr. Reed has evaluated Thomas extensively and determined that immediate institutional care is the only humane option."
At that moment, District Attorney Marcus Cole stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may interrupt, 3 hours ago, officers from the County Financial Crimes Unit executed a search warrant at the offices of Dr. Kenneth Reed. We recovered email correspondence between Dr. Reed and Mr. Mark Davis, the respondent's son-in-law." Cole opened a folder and read aloud. "Payment of $50,000 will be wired upon execution of the preliminary dementia certification for Thomas Vance, ensuring full authority transfer prior to the land purchase agreement with West Coast Realty." The courtroom erupted into quiet, shocked murmurs. Mark slammed his hands on the table, standing up in a panic. "This is a setup. We were just trying to manage the property. Thomas was ruining the family business." "Sit down, sir," Judge Harrison shouted, his face red with anger, hammering his gavel repeatedly. "Sit down, or I will have you held in contempt immediately." Mark collapsed back into his chair, his hands shaking violently, staring at the floor as his entire world imploded around him. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. Tears, real tears this time, finally spilling over her cheeks. "Dad, Dad, please listen to me. Mark made me do it. He said we were in debt. He said we were going to lose our house. I didn't want to hurt you, I swear." I stood at my table, looking at my daughter. The pain in my chest was unbearable, a quiet, crushing heartbreak that no court victory could ever heal. "You told the bank I didn't know who I was, Chloe.
You gave me pills to make my head foggy. You built a fake hospital file to lock your own father in a room for the rest of his life, just so you could pave over your mother's memory for a real estate check? "Dad, please," she sobbed, taking a step toward me, reaching her hands out. "I'm your daughter. I'm your little girl." "My little girl loved this land," I said softly, looking her straight in the eye. "My little girl wouldn't have tried to erase her father." Judge Harrison banged his gavel one final time, the sound ringing out like a final judgment on 40 years of family history. "The petition for conservatorship is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, based on the evidence presented by the district attorney, I am issuing an immediate protective order barring Chloe Vance and Mark Davis from entering the property of Thomas Vance. Bailiffs, take Mr. Davis into custody regarding the outstanding fraud warrant." 2 armed officers stepped forward, pulling Mark's arms behind his back and snapping handcuffs around his wrists. Mark shouted and swore, his smooth salesman persona completely shattered as he was dragged out through the side doors.
Chloe sank onto the courtroom bench, burying her face in her hands, weeping hysterically, as her high-priced lawyer stepped away from her, realizing there was nothing left to defend. I didn't watch her cry, I didn't yell at her, I didn't celebrate. I simply closed my leather notebook, placed it inside my coat pocket, nodded respectfully to Dr. Mercer and Judge Harrison, and walked out of the courtroom with my head held high. 3 weeks later, the spring sun was shining bright over eastern Washington. The legal dust had settled. Mark was facing federal wire fraud and conspiracy charges, looking at up to 7 years in state prison. Dr. Reed's medical license was permanently revoked, and he was under investigation for multiple fraudulent conservatorship schemes across the state. Chloe was spared prison time through a plea agreement, but she lost her house, her marriage, her reputation, and every cent she had ever borrowed against the family estate. She was forced to move to another state, working a low-paying retail job just to pay off her massive legal debts. I sat on the front porch of my farmhouse, holding a warm cup of coffee in my calloused hands. The 400 acres of Vance orchards stretched out before me, a sea of bright green leaves and delicate white apple blossoms blowing softly in the spring breeze. The tractors were humming down in the lower valley, managed by my loyal orchard crew, preparing for what looked to be the biggest harvest in 10 years. I walked down the porch steps and strolled slowly into the rows of trees. I stopped beside an old thick-trunked golden delicious tree, the very first tree Sarah and I had planted together 40 years ago. I reached out and touched the rough, sturdy bark, feeling the strength of the deep roots buried far beneath the soil. The land was safe. The legacy was protected. No developer's bulldozer would ever tear down what Sarah and I had built with our lives. My grandchildren, Chloe's 2 teenage kids, who had refused to go with their mother after learning the truth, were coming to live with me in the summer, eager to learn how to manage the orchard and keep the family name clean and honest. I stood there in the quiet beauty of the orchard as the afternoon sun warmed my face. I had saved my home. I had saved my sanity. I had won the battle in court and protected everything I owned. But as I looked down on the silent dirt path where my daughter used to run and play as a child, a single tear fell from my eyes and sank into the dark, rich earth. I had saved my life's work, but I had lost my daughter forever. And as the spring wind rustled through the apple blossoms, I knew that no amount of land, money, or justice could ever mend the quiet, broken heart of a father.